In the misty alleys of York, England, on a crisp April 13th, 1570, a child was born who would one day become the face of rebellion and anti-establishment fervor. Guy Fawkes, christened Guido at birth, entered a world rife with religious tension and political upheaval. The son of Edward Fawkes, a proctor of the ecclesiastical courts and advocate of the consistory court of the Archbishop of York, and Edith Blake, Guy was born into a family of some standing in York society. His birthplace, a house in Stonegate, still stands today, marked with a commemorative plaque that reads, "Guy Fawkes, the conspirator, was born in a house on this site April 13th, 1570. Young Guido's early years were spent in the shadow of York Minster, the grand cathedral that dominated the skyline and the spiritual life of the city. He attended St. Peter's School in York, a prestigious institution that would later boast of its infamous alumnus with a mixture of pride and trepidation. It was here that Fawkes formed friendships with fellow students who would later play roles in the fateful Gunpowder plot, including John and Christopher Wright. Interestingly, St. Peter's School still celebrates Fawkes Night on November 5th, but unlike the rest of England, they refused to burn his effigy, honouring an old school tradition of not burning former pupils. As a boy, Fawkes was described as pleasant of approach and cheerful of manner, yet prudent and judicious of mind by a contemporary chronicler. These qualities would serve him well in his later clandestine activities. However, the death of his father, when Guy was just 8 years old, cast a long shadow over his formative years. His mother's subsequent remarriage to a recusant Catholic, Dionys Bainbrig, in 1578, would prove pivotal in shaping young Guy's religious convictions. Bainbrig's influence introduced Fawkes to the underground world of persecuted Catholics, setting him on a path that would lead to infamy. The England of Fawkes' youth was a nation in the throes of religious turmoil. Queen Elizabeth I's Protestant regime had imposed harsh penalties on Catholics, including fines for non-attendance at Anglican services and the execution of priests. This oppressive atmosphere would kindle a flame of resentment in the young Fawkes, a flame that would grow into a consuming fire of rebellion. The Jesuit priest John Gerard, who later met Fawkes, wrote of the times, "The persecution was so severe that the intensity of their sufferings was no longer bearable." At the age of 21, in 1591, Guy Fawkes sold the estate he had inherited from his father and set out for the continent, seeking adventure and a chance to fight for his faith. He found both in the Spanish Netherlands, where he enlisted in the army of Archduke Albert of Austria. For over a decade, Fawkes fought in the 80 Years' War against the Protestant Dutch rebels who sought independence from Catholic Spain. He was present at the Siege of Calais in 1596, a brutal conflict that saw the town fall to Spanish forces after a 10-day assault. It was during this time that Fawkes honed his military skills, particularly in the use of explosives. He gained a reputation as a skilled soldier and strategist, rising to the rank of captain. His exploits on the battlefield earned him the respect of his comrades and superiors alike. One Spanish officer described him as a man of excellent good natural parts, very resolute and universally learned. Fawkes' proficiency with gunpowder was noted in military records, a skill that would later prove crucial to the Gunpowder plot. Fawkes' time in the Spanish Netherlands also deepened his Catholic faith and his resentment towards Protestant England. He even adopted a more continental version of his name, styling himself as Guido Fawkes. In 1603, he travelled to Spain to petition King Philip III for support in launching a Catholic rebellion in England. Although his mission was unsuccessful, it demonstrated Fawkes' growing commitment to the Catholic cause and his willingness to take bold action. During this visit, he met with the Constable of Castile, Juan de Velasco, who described Fawkes as a man of great piety and of exemplary temperance. Upon his return to England in 1604, Fawkes found a country still hostile to Catholics, despite the ascension of James I to the throne. Many Catholics had hoped that James, the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, would be more tolerant of their faith. Their hopes were quickly dashed as James continued and even intensified the persecution of Catholics. It was in this atmosphere of disappointment and desperation that Fawkes was introduced to Robert Catesby, the charismatic leader of what would become known as the Gunpowder Plot. They met at the Duck and Drake Inn in the Strand, London, a popular meeting place for Catholic dissidents. Catesby's audacious plan to blow up the Houses of Parliament during the state opening, killing the king and much of the Protestant nobility, appealed to Fawkes's military experience and religious zeal. As Fawkes later confessed, the nature of the disease required so sharp a remedy. The powder keg that almost ignited, a tale of treason and gunpowder. In the shadowy underbelly of early 17th century London, a group of disgruntled Catholic conspirators huddled in secret, their whispers barely audible above the crackling fire. It was May 20th, 1604, and in a small house on Butcher Row in the Strand, a plan was taking shape that would shake the very foundations of England. At the heart of this clandestine gathering was Robert Catesby, a charismatic 33-year-old gentleman from Lapworth, Warwickshire, whose fervent Catholic faith had been pushed to its limits by years of persecution under Protestant rule. Catesby, who had already been involved in the failed Essex Rebellion of 1601, was no stranger to sedition. His family had suffered greatly for their faith. His father had spent time in prison and paid hefty fines for recusancy. The Gunpowder Plot, as it would come to be known, was born out of desperation and religious fervor. King James I, who had ascended to the throne just a year earlier in 1603, had dashed the hopes of English Catholics who had expected greater tolerance under his reign. Instead, James had intensified the persecution, declaring in his first speech to Parliament on March 19, 1604, "I will make them conform themselves, or I will harry them out of the land." These words echoed in Catesby's mind as he outlined his audacious plan to his fellow conspirators. The plot was as simple as it was devastating: to blow up the House of Lords during the state opening of Parliament, killing the king, his family, and the Protestant ruling elite in one fell swoop. In the ensuing chaos, the conspirators planned to kidnap the king's young daughter, Princess Elizabeth, from Combe Abbey near Coventry, and install her as a Catholic monarch. It was a plan of breathtaking ambition and terrifying consequences, reminiscent of the Babington plot of 1586 that had aimed to assassinate Queen Elizabeth I and place Mary, Queen of Scots, on the English throne. Gathered around Catesby that fateful night were his cousin Thomas Wintour, a 33-year-old lawyer from Huddington Court, Worcestershire; John Wright, a 36-year-old Yorkshire gentleman known for his skill with a sword; Thomas Percy, a 44-year-old nobleman and distant relative of the powerful Earl of Northumberland; and Guy Fawkes, a 34-year-old soldier from York who had adopted the Italian version of his name, Guido, during his time fighting for Catholic Spain in the Low Countries. Each man brought unique skills to the conspiracy. Wintour, a skilled linguist who spoke Latin, Greek, and several modern languages, had connections on the continent. Wright, along with his brother Christopher, who would later join the plot, was known for his swordsmanship and had been involved in the Essex Rebellion alongside Catesby. Percy, as gentleman pensioner, provided an air of aristocratic legitimacy and had access to the royal court. But it was Guy Fawkes, with his military experience and expertise in explosives gained during the 80 Years' War, who would become the linchpin of the operation. As the conspiracy grew, so did its ranks. Over the following months, the plotters carefully recruited others to their cause. Francis Tresham, a 37-year-old gentleman from Rushton, Northamptonshire, whose father had been imprisoned with Catesby's for harbouring the Jesuit priest Edmund Campion in 1581, joined the group. Everard Digby, a 25-year-old knight from Stoke Dry, Rutland, was brought in for his wealth and connections. Robert Wintour, Thomas's 36-year-old brother, also joined the inner circle. Each was sworn to secrecy with a solemn oath taken on a prayer book in a ceremony conducted by the Jesuit priest John Gerard at Catesby's lodgings in Lambeth. By March 1605, the group had swelled to 13 members, a number that would later be seen as an ill omen. The conspirators were well aware of the stakes, as Shakespeare wrote in his play Macbeth, first performed in 1606, just months after the plot's discovery. To show an unfelt sorrow is an office which the false man does easy. The logistics of the plot were daunting. The conspirators needed to acquire a large quantity of gunpowder and find a way to plant it directly beneath the House of Lords. Fortune seemed to smile on them when Thomas Percy, using his position as a gentleman pensioner, managed to rent a ground-floor cellar from John Wynyard, keeper of the King's Wardrobe. This cellar extended right under the Parliament building, providing the perfect location for their explosives. Over the following months, the plotters smuggled 36 barrels of gunpowder into the cellar, disguising them as coal and firewood. This amount of explosives, estimated at about 2,500 kilograms, would have been more than enough to reduce the Houses of Parliament to rubble. Guy Fawkes, using the alias John Johnson and posing as Percy's servant, was tasked with guarding the gunpowder and preparing the fuse. His military experience made him the ideal candidate for this crucial role. Fawkes took his responsibility seriously, spending long hours in the dank cellar, ready to light the fuse at a moment's notice. His dedication was such that when later asked by King James what he would have done if he had been discovered, he replied with chilling resolve, "I would have blown you up, house, self and all." This cold determination would later earn him grudging admiration from the king himself, who described Fawkes as possessing a Roman resolution. As the date of the state opening of Parliament approached, tension among the conspirators mounted. The original date of February 7, 1605, had been postponed due to fears of the plague, which had killed more than 30,000 Londoners in 1603 alone. The new date was set for November 5th, and the plotters saw this delay as divine providence, giving them more time to perfect their plan. During this time, they also began to prepare for the aftermath of the explosion. Catesby arranged for a hunting party to gather at Dunchurch in Warwickshire, ostensibly for a deer hunt, but actually to serve as a cover for the planned uprising in the Midlands. However, cracks began to appear in the conspiracy. Some of the plotters, particularly Francis Tresham, began to have second thoughts about the scale of destruction they were planning. Tresham, whose brothers-in-law, Lord Monteagle and Lord Staunton, would be present at the state opening, was especially troubled. On October 26th, an anonymous letter was delivered to William Parker, 4th Baron Monteagle, warning him to avoid attending Parliament. On the night of November 4th, 1605, Guy Fawkes descended into the cellar for the last time, ready to light the fuse that would change the course of English history. He carried with him a pocket watch given to him by Percy, set to go off at the appointed hour, and a slow match and touchwood for igniting the gunpowder. The watch, a relatively new invention at the time, symbolized the precision timing required for the plot's success. Little did Fawkes know that his every move was being watched. The king, having been shown the Monteagle letter, had insisted on a search of the Parliament buildings, saying, "The letter might be written by a fool, but could only be counterfeited by a wise knave." The fuse that failed, unraveling the gunpowder plot's final hours. In the crisp autumn air of London in 1605, a single letter would spark a chain of events that would unravel the most audacious conspiracy England had ever faced. On the evening of October 26th, as the city prepared for the upcoming state opening of Parliament, Lord William Parker, 4th Baron Monteagle, sat down to supper at his house in Hoxton. Little did he know that the letter delivered to him that night would change the course of history. The house, located on what is now Hoxton Street, was a grand Tudor mansion befitting Monteagle's status as a peer of the realm. The missive, penned in a scrawling hand, was as cryptic as it was alarming. "My lord," it began, "out of the love I bear to some of your friends, I have a care of your preservation. Therefore I would advise you, as you tender your life, to devise some excuse to shift your attendance at this Parliament." The letter went on to warn of a terrible blow to be struck against Parliament, cautioning that the danger would be over as quick as it is subtle. The identity of the letter's author remains a mystery to this day, though many historians believe it was written by Francis Tresham, one of the conspirators and Monteagle's brother-in-law. This act of betrayal would later be echoed in Shakespeare's words from Macbeth, written shortly after these events. "There's daggers in men's smiles." Monteagle, perplexed by the letter's contents, immediately rode to Whitehall Palace to show it to Robert Cecil, 1st Earl of Salisbury and the King's spymaster. Cecil, a shrewd and calculating man who had uncovered numerous plots against the crown, recognized the gravity of the warning. However, he chose to bide his time, hoping to catch the conspirators red-handed. Cecil's patience was legendary. He had spent years carefully cultivating a network of spies and informants throughout England and Europe. His motto, "Video et taceo," I see and say nothing, perfectly encapsulated his approach to statecraft. As the days ticked by, tension mounted in the corridors of power. King James I, upon being shown the letter on November 1st, interpreted it with a flash of insight that would prove crucial. "The more I think upon the letter," he declared, "the more do I find it to be confused. And the last words, 'The danger is past as soon as you have burnt the letter,' are likely to imply the danger to be great and sudden." The king insisted on a thorough search of the Parliament buildings. James, who had authored a treatise on witchcraft called Demonologie in 1597, was known for his intellectual curiosity and his belief in divine right. His interpretation of the letter would later be seen as evidence of his self-proclaimed role as God's representative on earth. On the night of November 4th, 1605, as London lay shrouded in darkness, Sir Thomas Knivet, Keeper of Westminster Palace, led a search party through the warren of cellars beneath the House of Lords. The air was thick with anticipation and the musty scent of damp stone. As they descended into the gloom, lanterns casting long shadows on the walls, they came upon a sight that would etch itself into the annals of English history. The Palace of Westminster, originally built in the 11th century, had been the seat of the English Parliament since the 13th century. Its labyrinthine cellars, some dating back to medieval times, provided the perfect hiding place for the conspirators' deadly cargo. There, in a cellar rented by Thomas Percy, stood a man calling himself John Johnson. He was dressed for travel with a cloak, boots and spurs, as if ready for a swift departure. This was, in fact, Guy Fawkes, the explosives expert of the Gunpowder plot, caught in the act of guarding 36 barrels of gunpowder, enough to reduce Parliament to rubble. Fawkes, a man of 35 years with a soldier's bearing and a fanatic's resolve, remained remarkably composed. When questioned about his presence, he coolly replied that he was a servant of Thomas Percy, the cellar's tenant. His demeanour was so convincing that Knivet might have left him be, had it not been for the king's insistence on a thorough search. Fawkes's composure in the face of capture would later inspire the English proverb, "Keep your powder dry," a reminder to maintain one's composure in difficult situations. As the search party moved deeper into the cellar, they discovered the deadly cache hidden beneath piles of firewood and coal. The realization of what they had stumbled upon sent a chill through the men. They had uncovered a plot of unprecedented scale and audacity. The 36 barrels contained an estimated 2,500 kilograms of gunpowder. To put this in perspective, the largest non-nuclear explosion ever created by humans, the British Bang experiment of 1947, used 4,144 tons of surplus wartime explosives and created a blast wave that traveled at 720 miles per hour. The explosion, had it occurred, would have been devastating, likely destroying much of Westminster and damaging buildings as far away as Whitehall. Fawkes was immediately arrested and brought before the King and his Privy Council in the early hours of November 5th. His resolve, even in the face of capture, was remarkable. When asked by one of the Scottish courtiers present why he had collected so much gunpowder, Fawkes replied with grim humour, "To blow you Scotch beggars back to your native mountains." This defiance echoed the words of another famous rebel, William Wallace, who had declared 2 centuries earlier, "I could not be a traitor to Edward, for I was never his subject." King James, both terrified and fascinated by the plot against his life, personally supervised Fawkes's interrogation. In a letter, he described the prisoner as possessing a Roman resolution, Indeed, Fawkes's initial interrogation yielded little, as he steadfastly refused to name his co-conspirators or provide details of the plot. The king, who had narrowly escaped assassination in the Gowrie conspiracy of 1600, was determined to get to the bottom of this new threat to his reign. However, the king was determined to extract a confession. On November 6th, he issued a warrant authorizing torture. The gentler tortures are to be first used unto him, et sic per gradus ad ima tenditur, and so by degrees proceeding to the worst. Fawkes was transferred to the Tower of London, where he would face the cruel ministrations of the rack. The Tower, with its long history of housing political prisoners, had seen many famous inmates, including Sir Walter Raleigh, who was coincidentally imprisoned there at the time of Fawkes' arrest. The Tower, a grim fortress on the banks of the Thames, had long been a place of dread for those accused of treason. In its dank chambers, Fawkes would endure unimaginable suffering. The rack, a fiendish device designed to stretch the body to its limits, was employed with brutal efficiency. Inch by agonizing inch, Fawkes' body was pulled apart, his joints dislocating with sickening pops. The torture was supervised by William Ward, lieutenant of the Tower, who had previously overseen the interrogation of other Catholic plotters, including the Jesuit priest John Gerard. For 2 days, Fawkes resisted, his body broken but his will intact. However, on November 7th, his resolve finally crumbled. In a confession signed with a shaky hand, barely legible due to the torture he had endured, Fawkes revealed the full extent of the plot and named his co-conspirators. The confession, still preserved in the National Archives, provides a chilling account of the conspirators' plans, including their intention to tunnel under Parliament before they discovered the convenient cellar. The signature on this confession, a far cry from his usual firm hand, tells a story of its own. Where once he'd signed his name with a flourish as Guido Fawkes, now he could barely manage a trembling Guido. This signature, preserved in the National Archives, serves as a chilling testament to the ordeal he had endured. The stark contrast between his earlier signatures and this final tortured scrawl has led some historians to question the legitimacy of the confession, echoing the words of the Roman historian Tacitus, "Men are more ready to believe what they least understand." As news of the plot spread, London erupted in a frenzy of celebration and anti-Catholic sentiment. Bonfires were lit across the city, burning effigies of the Pope alongside those of Guy Fawkes. In the aftermath, the other conspirators were swiftly rounded up. Some, including the plot's mastermind Robert Catesby, died resisting arrest in a shootout at Holbeche House in Staffordshire on November 8th. The house, a Tudor manor dating from the 16th century, still stands today, its walls bearing the scars of that fateful day. The survivors, including Fawkes, were tried for high treason in Westminster Hall on January 27, 1606. The trial, presided over by Sir John Popham, Lord Chief Justice of England, was a spectacle of judicial theatre, with the accused facing a foregone conclusion. Justice's grim theatre, the spectacle of treason's reckoning. On a frost-bitten January morning in 1606, the Great Hall of Westminster Palace buzzed with a palpable tension. The vaulted ceiling, witness to centuries of royal banquets and political intrigues, now echoed with the murmurs of anticipation as London's elite jostled for prime positions. They had come to witness the trial of the century, the men who had dared to plot the annihilation of king, lords and commons in one fell swoop. The hall itself, built in 1097 under William II, had seen its share of historic trials, including that of William Wallace in 1305 and Sir Thomas More in 1535. Now it would add another chapter to its storied history. Among the accused, Guy Fawkes cut a gaunt figure. His frame, once robust from years of soldiering in Flanders, was now a shadow of its former self, ravaged by weeks of interrogation in the Tower of London. Alongside him stood 7 co-conspirators: Robert Wintour, Thomas Wintour, Ambrose Rookwood, Robert Keyes, Thomas Bates, Sir Everard Digby, and John Grant. Their faces were etched with a mixture of defiance and resignation. The weight of their failed plot hung heavy in the air, as tangible as the chains that bound their wrists. The trial, presided over by the formidable Sir John Popham, Lord Chief Justice of England, commenced on January 27, 1606. Popham, known for his harsh sentences and unwavering loyalty to the crown, glowered down at the accused from his elevated bench. His reputation preceded him. He had presided over the trials of Sir Walter Raleigh and the Earl of Essex, both of which had ended in death sentences. The charges were read out in ringing tones that reverberated through the hall. High treason against His Majesty King James I, attempted regicide, and conspiracy to subvert the true religion of England. The gravity of these charges was underscored by the Treason Act of 1351, which defined high treason as encompassing any attempt to compass or imagine the death of the sovereign. As the evidence was presented, gasps and murmurs rippled through the assembled crowd. The prosecution, led by the eloquent Sir Edward Coke, painted a vivid picture of the conspirators' nefarious plans. Coke, whose legal acumen was matched only by his theatrical flair, held aloft a lantern, the very one found with Fawkes in the cellars beneath Parliament. "Behold," he thundered, "the light that would have ushered in our darkness." Coke's oratory was renowned. He had famously prosecuted the Earl of Essex in 1601, declaring, "The law is the safeguard of liberty." Now he turned that same skill against Fawkes and his co-conspirators. The defendants, denied legal counsel as was customary in cases of high treason, were left to speak for themselves. Some, like Robert Keyes, maintained a stoic silence. Others, such as Sir Everard Digby, pleaded for mercy on account of their noble birth. Digby, whose wife, Anne Throckmorton, was a cousin of Francis Tresham, suspected of writing the warning letter to Lord Monteagle, appealed to the court's sense of class loyalty. Fawkes, when called upon, spoke in a voice hoarse from torture, but unwavering in conviction. The trial was a foregone conclusion, a piece of political theatre designed to showcase the king's mercy in allowing due process, even as it inexorably marched towards a predetermined verdict. After a mere one-day proceeding, all 8 men were found guilty. The speed of the trial was not unusual for the time. The trial of the Babington plotters in 1586 had lasted only 2 days. Lord Chief Justice Popham, his voice carrying the weight of the realm, pronounced the sentence, "You are to be drawn on hurdles to the place of execution, where you shall be hanged by the neck, cut down alive, your body opened and your heart and bowels taken out and burnt before your eyes, then your head to be cut off and your body divided into 4 quarters." This gruesome sentence, standard for high treason, had its origins in the reign of Edward I, and was designed not just to punish, but to utterly destroy the traitor in body and soul. The grisly spectacle of their execution was set for January 30th and 31, 1606, in the old palace yard at Westminster, mere steps from the Parliament building they had sought to destroy. As dawn broke on the 30th, London stirred with a macabre excitement. Thousands flocked to witness the gruesome pageant of state retribution, jostling for space on rooftops and makeshift scaffolds. Public executions were a common form of entertainment in Jacobean England. The execution of the Earl of Essex in 1601 had drawn crowds of 30,000 to Tower Hill. The first day saw the execution of Sir Everard Digby, Robert Wintour, John Grant and Thomas Bates. Each man was dragged on a wooden hurdle from the Tower to Westminster, a journey of public humiliation through streets lined with jeering crowds. The route took them past landmarks such as St. Paul's Cathedral and Ludgate Hill, where the severed heads of previous traitors served as grim reminders of the fate that awaited them. At the scaffold, they faced their final moments with varying degrees of composure. Digby, ever the aristocrat, addressed the crowd with eloquence, expressing remorse not for the plot itself but for its failure. His last words, "I am a Catholic and a gentleman," spoke volumes about the social and religious tensions that had led to the plot. The following day, it was the turn of Fawkes, Thomas Wintour, Ambrose Rookwood, and Robert Keyes to meet their fate. Fawkes, once the very embodiment of the plot's menace, was now a broken man. Yet as he climbed the ladder to the gallows, a flicker of his old defiance returned. In a final act that would echo through history, Fawkes leapt from the scaffold, breaking his neck and cheating the executioner of his grim task. This act of defiance, or perhaps desperation, would later be immortalized in the words of the 17th century poet John Dryden. "Great wits are sure to madness near allied, and thin partitions do their bounds divide." The other conspirators were not so fortunate. The crowd watched in horrified fascination as the full brutality of their sentence was carried out. The men were hanged until nearly dead, then cut down and disemboweled while still conscious. Their hearts were torn out and burned before their fading eyes, a symbolic destruction of the seat of their treasonous intentions. The executioner, a man named Edward Dunn, was known for his skill in prolonging the agony of the condemned. He had previously officiated at the execution of the priest John Bost in 1594, and his reputation for cruelty was well established. As the day wore on and the grisly work continued, even the most bloodthirsty spectators began to pale. John Donne, the metaphysical poet who witnessed the executions, would later reflect, "Any man's death diminishes me because I am involved in mankind." Donne, who had Catholic sympathies and connections to some of the conspirators, was deeply affected by the spectacle. His poem, No Man is an Island, is thought to have been inspired in part by these events. The sheer barbarity of the punishments, intended to serve as the ultimate deterrent, instead sowed seeds of sympathy in some quarters. The impact of the executions rippled through English society. For Catholics, already under suspicion and facing increasing restrictions, it marked a dark new chapter. The government used the plot as justification for even harsher penal laws against Catholics, including the Popish Recusants Act of 1605, which imposed crippling fines on those who refused to attend Anglican services. This act, along with the Oath of Allegiance introduced in 1606, created a climate of fear and suspicion that would persist for generations. Embers of Rebellion, the fiery legacy of Guy Fawkes Night. As twilight descends on the 5th of November, the crisp autumn air across Britain crackles with anticipation. In countless towns and villages, from the Scottish Highlands to the Cornish coast, bonfires begin to flicker to life, their flames licking at the darkening sky. The acrid scent of smoke mingles with the sugary aroma of toffee apples and the sharp tang of gunpowder. Children, their faces aglow with excitement, clutch sparklers that paint ephemeral patterns in the night. This is Bonfire Night, also known as Guy Fawkes Night, a uniquely British celebration that has endured for over 4 centuries. In the words of the 17th century poet John Milton, it's a night when the city doth of its own accord blaze with 1,000 bonfires. In the immediate aftermath of the failed Gunpowder plot, King James I declared November 5th a day of thanksgiving. The people of London, relieved at their narrow escape from catastrophe, lit bonfires to celebrate the king's survival. This spontaneous outpouring of joy and relief would soon be codified into law. In January 1606, the observance of the 5th of November Act was passed, mandating that the day be commemorated annually with special church services and the lighting of bonfires. The Act remained in force until 1859, making it one of the longest-standing pieces of legislation in English history. As the years passed, the celebrations evolved, taking on new customs and traditions. By the 1630s, fireworks had become a common feature of the festivities. Their inclusion was both symbolic and practical, a nod to the gunpowder that had failed to ignite in 1605, and a spectacular way to light up the autumn night. The first recorded use of fireworks in these celebrations comes from a 1636 account by the antiquarian John Stowe, who described squibs and crackers being set off in London's streets. Interestingly, the development of fireworks in England owes much to the royal pyrotechnician John Bate, who published The Mysteries of Nature and Art in 1634, including detailed instructions for making fireworks. Perhaps the most iconic tradition associated with Bonfire Night is the burning of the guy. This practice began in the early 18th century, with children creating effigies of Guy Fawkes using old clothes, stuffed with straw or newspaper. These guys would be paraded through the streets, with children asking passers-by for a penny for the guy to raise money for fireworks. The effigies would then be thrown onto the bonfire, a symbolic punishment of the long-dead conspirator. This tradition was immortalized in T.S. Eliot's poem The Hollow Men, 1925, with the lines, "A penny for the old guy, I remember the dead man's penny." The burning of the guy took on a life of its own, often reflecting the political and social tensions of the day. In 1832, during the height of debates over electoral reform, effigies of the Duke of Wellington and other opponents of the Reform Bill were burned alongside, or instead of, Guy Fawkes. In 1867, a guy depicting the Fenian leader Michael Barrett was burned in London, reflecting tensions over Irish nationalism. This tradition of burning effigies of unpopular figures continues in some places today, most notably in Lewes, East Sussex, where elaborate effigies of controversial public figures are paraded through the town before being consigned to the flames. In recent years, figures such as Donald Trump, Boris Johnson, and Vladimir Putin have all been given the Guy treatment in Lewes. As the centuries passed, the religious and political significance of Bonfire Night began to fade, replaced by a more secular celebration of community and tradition. The rhyme, "Remember, remember, the 5th of November, gunpowder, treason and plot," once a genuine call to commemorate a thwarted attack, became a playful incantation for children. The figure of Guy Fawkes himself underwent a curious transformation in the public imagination, evolving from reviled traitor to a symbol of anti-establishment rebellion. This shift was noted by the historian Antonia Fraser, who wrote in her book The Gunpowder Plot, Terror and Faith in 1605 Inches, 1996. Guy Fawkes has been reincarnated in the 20th century as a kind of anti-hero, at least to the young. This shift was particularly evident in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. The 1980s graphic novel V for Vendetta by Alan Moore and David Lloyd, later adapted into a film in 2005, reimagined Fawkes as an anarchist hero fighting against a totalitarian government. The stylized Guy Fawkes mask worn by the protagonist became an icon of protest movements worldwide, most notably adopted by the hacker group Anonymous. In 2011, Time magazine named this mask as the Person of the Year, recognizing its widespread use in protests from Wall Street to the Arab Spring. Despite these cultural shifts, Bonfire Night remains a beloved tradition in the United Kingdom. Each year, over 3,000 public fireworks displays are held across the country, attracting millions of spectators. The largest of these events, like the Lewes bonfire celebrations or London's Battersea Park display, can draw crowds of over 30,000 people. The Lewes celebrations, in particular, are known for their scale and intensity, involving 6 bonfire societies and multiple processions through the town. The author Louis de Bernière once described the Lewes celebrations as a pagan fire festival with a veneer of historical meaning. The scale of these celebrations has led to some controversy in recent years. Environmental concerns about air pollution from bonfires and fireworks have prompted some local councils to seek alternatives. In 2019, Lambeth Council in London replaced its traditional fireworks display with a laser light show, citing both environmental and cost concerns. Similarly, in 2018, the town of Dundee in Scotland replaced its bonfire with a fire garden of flaming sculptures. These changes reflect growing awareness of environmental issues, echoing the words of naturalist Sir David Attenborough. The future of humanity, and indeed all life on Earth, now depends on us. Yet for many Britons, Bonfire Night remains an essential part of the autumn calendar, a night when communities come together to share in a spectacle of light and warmth as the days grow shorter and colder. The food associated with the night, toffee apples, baked potatoes and warming soups, speaks to its nature as a harvest festival as much as a historical commemoration. In Yorkshire, it's traditional to eat parkin, a sticky ginger cake, on Bonfire Night. The origins of this tradition are unclear, but some link it to the region's strong Guy Fawkes connections. Fawkes was born in York and attended St. Peter's School in the city. In some parts of the country, particularly in the north of England, bonfire night traditions have taken on unique local flavours. In Ottery St. Mary, Devon, the night is marked by the spectacular and dangerous custom of tar barrelling, where participants race through the streets, carrying flaming barrels of tar on their shoulders. This tradition, which dates back to the 17th century, sees 17 barrels of increasing size carried through the town, culminating in a midnight barrel weighing 30 kilograms. In Yorkshire, children recite a different version of the classic rhyme, "Plot, plot, thou shalt not be forgot, while York's on hill and Ous's stream doth glide." This local variation reflects York's connection to Guy Fawkes and the enduring nature of regional traditions. As the sparks fly upward and the Guy burns anew each year, those messages continue to be written in fire against the November sky, a testament to the enduring power of tradition and the ever-changing nature of cultural memory. In the glow of the bonfire, we see not just the reflection of a 400-year-old plot, but the face of Britain itself, ever-changing yet somehow timeless, its history and future intertwined in the dancing flames of a November night. Remember, it was the poet John Donne who wrote in 1626, "He keeps his soul alive with the food of fame." How prescient those words seem now, as we witness Fawkes' name echoing through the centuries, fed by bonfires and fireworks, rhymes and revelry. So as the last sparkler fizzles out and the bonfire's glow fades, we bid farewell to Guy Fawkes' night. But fear not, for in the whisper of every November wind, in the crackle of every flame, the spirit of the 5th lives on, ready to ignite our imaginations once more when autumn returns.